She didn't leave when I got hurt. That's what made it so hard to see. She stayed right there, sleeping beside me, driving me to appointments, sighing every time I needed something, while quietly moving money, consulting attorneys, and exchanging messages with a man whose number appeared 3 times in my call log from the week I was unconscious in Mission Hospital. I found all of it. The folder, the emails, the receipt from the dinner she swore she never went to. I found it the same way I find structural failures on job sites, slowly, methodically, without letting emotion get ahead of evidence. My name is Billy Lyon. I'm a structural engineer from Asheville, North Carolina. And this is the story of the most important inspection I ever did. Viewers, before we continue, please subscribe, like and share. My name is Billy Lyon. I'm a 38-year-old structural engineer based in Asheville, North Carolina, the kind of man who spent 15 years calculating load-bearing limits for bridges, never once imagining that the structure most likely to collapse beneath me was my own marriage. I drive a weathered F-150, keep a thermos of black coffee on my desk, and I show up early and stay late on every job site I've ever walked. People in this industry trust me because I don't cut corners. I never have. I married Maggie Billy 6 years ago in a ceremony overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains, her idea, the outdoor venue, and I remember thinking she looked like she belonged there, framed by all that open sky. She was a paralegal then, sharp and ambitious in ways I genuinely admired. We built a life that looked solid from every angle. That was the problem with us, I think, we looked solid. The morning everything changed, I remember the smell of wet concrete and a radio playing somewhere below the 3rd floor of a commercial build in downtown Asheville. I was inspecting a load-bearing joint when the temporary platform gave way beneath me. I didn't scream. I just fell, 11 feet, and the last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me was the foreman shouting my name. I woke up in Mission Hospital with a fractured tibia, a torn ACL, and 3 cracked ribs. The doctor used words like extended recovery and possible permanent mobility limitation, and I nodded like I was absorbing it, but my mind kept drifting to Maggie. I'd been there 4 hours. She hadn't come. When she finally walked through the door, she wasn't rushing. She had shopping bags looped over one wrist and her phone in her other hand, and she didn't cross the room to touch me. She stood near the door and the first words out of her mouth weren't "Are you okay?" They were, "How long are they saying you'll be out of work?" Something moved through her eyes when I said maybe 6 months. Not fear. Not grief. Calculation. They discharged me after 9 days. Maggie drove, but she spent most of the ride answering texts with one thumb, her phone tilted slightly away from me like a reflex she hadn't bothered to hide. I watched the mountains roll past my window and told myself she was stressed. I told myself I was reading into things because I was in pain and scared and dependent in ways I'd never been before. I was good at telling myself things back then. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed the guest bedroom light was on. I hadn't asked anyone to stay over. When I brought it up, she said a friend had crashed there while I was hospitalized, said it quickly, flatly, and changed the subject before I could follow up. Inside, the house felt different. Cleaner in some places, messier in others, like someone had lived there and then hastily erased themselves. A coffee mug I didn't recognize sat rinsed on the drying rack. A phone charger, not my brand, not Maggie's, was plugged into the hallway outlet. I stood on my crutches in that hallway for a long moment, just looking at it. Maggie walked past me toward the kitchen without a word. That night I lay in our bed staring at the ceiling while she slept beside me like nothing was wrong, and I thought about something she'd told me early in our relationship, that she'd spent 2 years with a man she described as emotionally absent, someone who made her feel invisible without ever raising his voice or lifting a hand. She said she'd never tolerate that again. I'd spent 6 years trying to be the opposite of that man. I coached youth soccer on weekends. I called when I said I would. I remembered things. I thought I'd been enough. Lying there that night, something shifted in my chest, quiet and irreversible, like a beam settling wrong inside a wall. On the kitchen counter the next morning I found a restaurant receipt. Dinner for two, West Asheville, dated 3 days after my accident. Maggie had told me she'd barely left the house that week. The first 2 weeks at home were the loneliest of my life. I couldn't drive. I could barely walk to the bathroom without pain radiating from my ankle to my hip, and I needed help with things I'd never needed help with before, small things, humiliating things, things that reminded me every hour that I was temporarily broken. Maggie made sure I felt every inch of that need. She sighed when I asked her to bring my medication. She answered questions about my physical therapy schedule with one-word responses and returned immediately to whatever was open on her laptop. Once I called out to her from the bedroom and she didn't answer for so long that I genuinely wondered if she'd left the house. She hadn't. She'd heard me. She'd simply waited, as if deciding whether I was worth the interruption. I started keeping a journal during those weeks. Not for therapy, I've never been that kind of man, but because something instinctive in me understood I needed a record. I wrote down dates and times and exact words. I wrote down the sighs. I wrote down the silences. I didn't know yet why I was doing it. I know now. What I didn't learn until later, through Maggie's sister Carolyn, who called me out of what I believe was genuine guilt, was that Maggie had consulted a real estate attorney 3 weeks before my accident. She had been quietly researching asset division in North Carolina marriages, specifically regarding properties held under a single name. She hadn't filed anything. But she had been preparing, and my injury hadn't derailed her plans. It had complicated the timing. I've thought about that a lot since. She'd been building the exit before the fall, and the fall just meant she had to wait longer than she wanted to. On day 16, I picked up Maggie's phone by mistake, identical case to mine. One notification glowed on the lock screen. A name I didn't recognize. And a message that read, plainly and without context, "Is he asleep yet?" His name was Roy Callahan, and he knocked on my door on day 18 without warning or announcement, holding a casserole dish in one hand and a six-pack in the other. We'd been friends since our early 20s, met on a job site in Knoxville back when we were both still learning which end of a level to trust. Roy had eventually left the industry and moved to a homestead outside Weaverville, about 20 minutes from Asheville, where he kept chickens, a sprawling vegetable garden, and 14 active beehives. He wasn't the type to call ahead. He was the type to just show up, which is the rarer and more valuable thing. When I opened the door on my crutches, he studied me for a long moment with that flat, honest expression he'd always had, the one that never bothered softening the truth, and said, "You look terrible, Billy." And for the first time since the accident, I laughed. A real laugh, from somewhere I thought had gone quiet. He stayed 3 hours. He didn't ask probing questions about Maggie. He didn't offer advice I hadn't requested. He just sat with me, drank one beer slowly, and talked about his bees with the kind of quiet enthusiasm that made you forget your own life for a while. Before he left, he said, "Come out to the property when you can manage it. Fresh air won't fix a broken leg, but it won't hurt it either." What I didn't know then was that Roy had his own reasons for showing up when he did. His wife Sandra had left him 4 years earlier, quietly, methodically, in a way that removed everything of value before he'd understood what was happening. Roy had rebuilt slowly, and in rebuilding he'd developed a particular instinct for recognizing certain patterns in people. He'd seen something in Maggie at our last dinner together, months before my accident, a careful, measuring quality in how she spoke about our future, and it had stayed with him like a splinter he couldn't locate. As Roy was leaving that evening, Maggie came downstairs. The look that passed between them lasted under 2 seconds. But Roy dropped his eyes first, and I filed that away. Roy had me out to the property by week 5. My leg was still in a brace, and he drove because I couldn't, and he didn't talk much on the way there, which I appreciated. The homestead sat on 11 acres of sloped land with old apple trees running along the south fence and the kind of silence that isn't really silence at all, it's just the absence of human noise, replaced by wind and birds and the low, continuous hum that grew stronger as we approached the hives. He set a wooden stool near the nearest box and told me to just sit. I sat for almost an hour without speaking. There's something about that sound, that purposeful, layered hum, that empties your mind in a way that nothing pharmaceutical had managed in 5 weeks. Roy worked nearby, checking frames, and at some point he pulled off his veil and said without looking at me, "Bees don't lie. They do exactly what they're built to do. No pretending." I thought about Maggie. I thought about the coffee mug and the receipt and the message on the lock screen and the charger in the hallway. Roy set down his smoker and told me something he'd never told me before. He said that 6 months before Sandra left, she had started what he called landscape clearing, systematically reducing his support network, redirecting his attention, engineering small conflicts with his closest friends until he was isolated. "You remove everything a man might lean on," he said, "so when you pull the ground from under him, there's nothing left to catch him." He looked at me then. Sound familiar? I didn't answer. But I drove home that evening with a different kind of attention running beneath my thoughts, not emotional, not panicked. Methodical. I am an engineer. I know how to audit a structure. That night I went to the filing cabinet in our home office looking for something mundane. Behind our tax returns I found a folder I had never seen. Inside were printed emails, a name I still didn't recognize, and a draft separation agreement dated 4 months prior. I read every page twice. Then I photographed each document with my phone and returned the folder to exactly the position I'd found it, same angle, same depth in the drawer, the tab aligned with the hanging file the way it had been. I'd spent 15 years reading structural documents under pressure. I knew how to process information without letting my face change. I stood in that office for a long time after, listening to the house. Upstairs, Maggie was asleep. The draft agreement was detailed and confident. It proposed she receive the house, the joint savings account, and a share of my pension, built on the legal argument that she had been the primary financial contributor during the marriage. That was false by every measurable standard. I had out-earned her each year we were married, and my name alone was on the mortgage. But the document read like someone had already told her it would hold up, like she'd been assured, specifically and recently, that the framing would work. 2 days later I called James Whitfield, a family law attorney in Charlotte and a friend since college. I'd helped him move into his first apartment in 2009, hauled furniture up 3 flights of stairs, and he'd told me then that he owed me one. I told him everything in a single 40-minute call, and he was quiet through most of it. At the end he said, "The agreement is aggressive but legally flawed. However, if she files while you're still injured and not working, a sympathetic judge could make things uncomfortable. You need to start building a record, and you need to be careful not to tip her off." I asked if this level of premeditation was common. He paused before answering. "Someone coached her, Billy." The name in the printed emails appeared in my call log, 3 calls, all under 3 minutes, all placed while I was hospitalized. I reverse-searched the number. It belonged to a paralegal firm in Asheville. Maggie had worked there before passing the bar. The lead paralegal, I found his photo in under 4 minutes, had shaken my hand at a holiday party 2 years ago and told me he'd heard so much about me. I spent the following 3 weeks moving carefully and without noise. I opened a separate account at a credit union across town and began routing a portion of my disability payments into it. I requested a certified copy of the mortgage from the county register. I contacted my employer's HR department to formally document my projected return-to-work date, which, contrary to what Maggie believed, my orthopedic surgeon had moved forward. I was healing faster than either of us had expected, though only one of us knew that. James advised me to document Maggie's behavior during my recovery, not to punish her emotionally, but because abandonment and deliberate neglect during a medical crisis carry legal weight in North Carolina. I began keeping time-stamped entries alongside the journal I'd already been writing. The sighs. The silences. The shopping receipts that surfaced on days she'd claimed to be working late. I cross-referenced dates. I kept copies of everything in the new account's associated email, which Maggie had no knowledge of and no access to. Roy helped me think through the logic of it during those visits to the property. He never pushed. He just listened, asked flat practical questions, and kept my thinking from drifting into anger. Anger, he told me once, is only useful when it's cold. During this period Roy told me the full story of what he'd observed at a dinner party at our house the previous fall. Maggie had pulled him into the kitchen briefly, while I was engaged with other guests, and asked whether he thought I was the type to handle change well. Roy had filed it as a vague question at the time. Now it read as reconnaissance. She had been testing his loyalty, gauging whether he might serve as a sympathetic witness to a narrative she was already drafting. She had miscalculated him entirely. My return-to-work date arrived on a Thursday. That evening I told Maggie the doctor had extended my leave by 6 more weeks. She processed this with her eyes before her expression caught up, and in that quarter-second gap I saw something she hadn't meant to show me: pure, involuntary relief. She believed me completely. In that moment, without a word exchanged, the weight of everything shifted. I chose a Sunday morning. No particular logic to it except that Sunday felt honest, no work to rush toward, no calendar excuse, just 2 people and a kitchen table and the light coming through the window the way it always had, indifferent to everything beneath it. I made coffee. I set the folder on the table between us and sat down across from her without saying anything. Maggie looked at the folder and then at me, and something in her face adjusted, though she kept her composure better than I expected. I didn't raise my voice once. I asked her, by name and in sequence, about the draft separation agreement. I asked about the paralegal. I asked about the dinner receipt, the guest bedroom, the phone charger in the hallway, the message on the lock screen, and the 3 calls made from our shared landline while I was still in the hospital. I asked each question in the tone I'd use reviewing load calculations on a disputed blueprint, even, precise, genuinely interested in the answer but not desperate for it. She moved through 5 stages in about 90 seconds. Manufactured confusion first. Then an attempt to reframe, to suggest I'd misread things, misunderstood the timeline. Then real fear when she realized I had the documents and had clearly had them for some time. Then anger, which surprised me, hot and reflexive, like I'd violated something by knowing. And then, finally, something quieter settled into her face. Something that looked almost like relief. As if she had been waiting for this moment too, and carrying the architecture of the lie had cost her more than she'd anticipated. She didn't deny everything. That was the thing I hadn't prepared for. She said, with a steadiness that told me she'd rehearsed some version of this, "I stopped believing in us before you got hurt, Billy. I should have told you that. I know I should have." The kitchen was absolutely still. Then she said the thing that changed the temperature of the entire room. "He told me you'd never find out. He said you trusted too much to look." James filed the preemptive legal motion on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the draft separation agreement Maggie had been holding in that filing cabinet was legally neutralized, because I had filed first, on solid footing, with documented evidence of financial misconduct, deliberate medical neglect, and bad faith planning that predated my injury by months. The mortgage remained in my name. The joint savings account, which Maggie had begun quietly drawing down in increments small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, was frozen pending full financial review. The paralegal was referred to the North Carolina State Bar's Ethics Board. James made that referral as a procedural matter, not a personal one, but I won't pretend I felt nothing when he told me the board had accepted it. What I hadn't anticipated was Carolyn. Maggie's sister had called me weeks earlier out of what I believed was guilt she could no longer distribute elsewhere. She now submitted a written statement to James confirming the precise timeline, when Maggie had first contacted the real estate attorney, when the separation framework had begun taking shape, and the specific conversation in which Carolyn had told her sister directly that what she was doing was wrong. Maggie hadn't listened. Carolyn had kept records anyway, the way careful people do when they sense they'll eventually need them. The thing about an elaborate, premeditated plan is that it requires everyone involved to remain loyal. Loyalty, as I had recently and thoroughly learned, is not something you can simply assume. I moved into Roy's spare room for 6 weeks while the legal process resolved. Every morning I walked out to the hives while the dew was still on the grass and the mountains were still blue-gray in the early light. I ate breakfast on the porch. I let the sound of the bees do what it had always done, empty the noise out and leave only what was real. My leg finished healing in that clean mountain air. On the last morning before I moved into my own apartment, Roy handed me a small jar of honey from the hive he'd built from reclaimed barn wood. He'd labeled it himself in black marker. It read, Hive 9. Started the same week you fell. I returned to work 7 weeks earlier than Maggie believed I would. My first morning back on site, I climbed a scaffold, tested the joints with my own hands, and stood above downtown Asheville looking at the skyline I'd spent 15 years helping build. My leg held. My hands were steady. The city looked exactly as it always had, indifferent, enduring, asking nothing from me except the work. The divorce finalized 4 months after the Sunday morning confrontation. I kept the house. Maggie relocated to Charlotte. The ethics review involving the paralegal continued through the fall, and James told me periodically that it was progressing. At some point I stopped asking for updates. Some resolutions don't require your attendance to be real. What I find myself thinking about most, when I'm honest, is not the betrayal itself. Betrayal is a human thing, painful, comprehensible, survivable. What stays with me is the silence that preceded it. The way a structure can appear perfectly sound from the outside while the load-bearing elements fail quietly within. I should have known. I am trained to find exactly that kind of hidden failure. But love makes poor inspectors of all of us, and I think that's not entirely a flaw. I think it's the cost of having believed in something genuinely. Roy's bees produced 42 pounds of honey that season. He gave me 6 jars. I still have 4 of them on a shelf in the kitchen of the house that is now, without complication, mine. I've started learning the craft myself, not to become a beekeeper in any serious sense, but because there's something worth sitting with in how a hive rebuilds after disruption. The bees don't grieve the broken comb. They don't catalog the loss or assign it meaning. They simply begin again, with the same deliberate, unhurried purpose they bring to everything. I've been learning to do the same. Some structures aren't worth repairing. Sometimes you read the ground, clear the site carefully, and build something that will actually hold. Carolyn called me last week. She said she'd found out something about the paralegal, and a third party neither of us had known about. Someone, she said, that I had trusted even longer than I'd trusted Maggie. I told her I'd hear her out. Some stories, it turns out, have more load-bearing walls than you first think. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and share.